3,000 guns. Destroyed, not by the enemy, by themselves. In just 1 year of World War I, Germany lost over 3,000 of its own artillery pieces to explosions inside the barrel, killing the very men loading them. France lost 600 more the same way. Read that again. These men weren't dying from an enemy they could see and fight back against. They were dying from the weapon in their own hands. And that was one of the better ways to go. Everyone talks about the horror of getting shelled. Nobody talks about the men behind the gun, deafened for life by a weapon with zero ear protection, poisoned by their own gas shells, buried alive when their own barrage fell short. 4 straight years of this, and almost nobody knows their story. If that shocked you, subscribe right now. Because the War Files exposes the side of history your textbooks conveniently left out every single week, and this story only gets darker from here. Let's get into it. Right before the war broke out, artillery quietly went through a revolution nobody saw coming. Smokeless powder replaced the old choking clouds of black powder. Ammunition switched to one-piece, breech-loaded shells that could be rammed home in seconds. And the single biggest leap came from a French invention, the recoil absorber. Here's why that mattered so much. Older field guns physically rolled backward several feet with every single shot. That meant the crew had to manhandle the entire gun back into position before firing again. A brutal, exhausting process called relaying that could take longer than the shot itself. And that thick cloud of black powder smoke didn't just give away exactly where you were hiding. It blinded your own crew, so you couldn't even see where your shells were landing. The French fix was brilliant. Let the barrel alone slide backward on firing, while the wheels and carriage stayed rooted in place. Oil pressure inside a piston absorbed the shock and smoothly braked the barrel's slide, while compressed air in a second cylinder pushed it right back into firing position, automatically every time. Combine that with smokeless powder and instant loading ammunition, and a gun that used to manage 2 or 3 aim shots a minute could suddenly unleash up to 20 rounds in that same 60 seconds. And yet, going into the war, military leaders still saw artillery as a support act, something to soften up the enemy for the infantry and cavalry to finish off with steel. Field guns were built light enough for horses to drag alongside marching troops, and gunners were trained to fire in a straight line at whatever they could physically see, using barely half of the weapon's real range. Nobody had fully grasped indirect fire yet, dropping shells over a hill onto a target you couldn't even see, and that meant men hiding behind cover, or dug into a trench, were still considered relatively safe. That illusion of safety was about to be shattered by a weapon few people were even talking about yet: the howitzer. Shorter barrel, slower shell, but fired almost straight up into the sky, meaning it could arc a shell down out of nowhere directly onto a man who genuinely believed he was untouchable behind his cover. But before we get to the truly monstrous artillery pieces this war would produce, let's talk about how the whole thing came apart in the first few weeks. When the war began, 6 horses hauled each gun into position, with a crew of 6 to 10 men trained to move fast, unhook the horses, drag the carriage into place, and start firing within minutes. This tactic had worked for a century. It was about to get slaughtered by the 20th. The enemy had the exact same modern artillery, the exact same machine guns, except dug into prepared defensive positions, hidden and waiting. When British batteries tried the old-school gallop, an fire approach against entrenched German lines, the result was a bloodbath in a matter of hours. Horses and gunners were cut down before the guns even fired a shot back, and the surviving cannons were abandoned, stranded, useless in the middle of no man's land. Every army tried this same frontal approach in the war's opening weeks. Every single time it failed catastrophically, so both sides tried to swing around each other's flanks instead, a desperate scramble northward that only ended when they physically ran out of continent, slamming into the North Sea in the north and the Swiss border in the south. What was left was 475 miles of trench, and the true horrifying career of the First World War artillery crew was only just beginning. Now here's that secret weapon I mentioned. Every fortress built before the war was designed to survive hits from the artillery of that era. Guns capped at roughly 200 nullium, with concrete walls up to 4 meters thick to absorb the blow. Germany knew that if they wanted to smash through Belgium and France fast, those forts had to fall, and fall quickly. So they built something monstrous, a 420 mm howitzer nicknamed Big Bertha. This beast weighed 40 tons, fired an 800-pound shell, and used a delayed fuse so the round would punch straight through solid concrete before detonating deep inside. It had to be hauled in by tractor and assembled piece by piece near the target. When one of these shells connected, there was no fortress left standing, just rubble. Supposedly indestructible strongholds fell in days, sometimes hours, permanently ending the entire concept of the impenetrable fortress. Austria-Hungary threw in their own monster, a 3D5 mm super heavy mortar to help finish the job. Once the trenches locked in place, nearly all artillery fire became indirect. Crews shooting blind over hills and ridgelines they couldn't see, at targets marked only on a map. It became a grim daily routine, almost like factory work. Crews fired test shots first to judge their aim, and if they weren't sure of the exact range, the unspoken rule was simple: fire long, not short. Because landing short meant killing your own men, which happened far more often than anyone wanted to admit. On the other end of the line sat an artillery observer glued to a telephone, relaying corrections back, until German shelling cut the wires, which happened constantly, and the job fell to runners sprinting through no man's land or to carrier pigeons. Here's the number that should genuinely disturb you. Every army entered this war expecting it to last about 6 months, and stocked roughly 1,000 shells per gun accordingly, mostly shrapnel rounds. Within 2 months, every single army was already running critically low. Shrapnel turned out to be nearly worthless against men hidden in trenches and dugouts, and completely useless for cutting through barbed wire. So governments threw everything into shell production, and women stepped into the factories in staggering numbers to keep the guns fed. Many of them losing their own lives in horrific industrial accidents doing it. As the war dragged on, the shells themselves kept evolving into new nightmares. Smoke shells to blind enemy spotters, star shells that popped a parachute flare and lit up no man's land like daylight at 2 a.m. But nothing on this list compares to what's coming next. Because these crews were about to be handed a weapon that could kill the man firing it just as easily as the man it was aimed at. Now here's the part that'll actually shock you. This is what a good day looked like. Not a battle, not a disaster, just Tuesday. First, they had to physically drag and position a multi-ton gun through torn-up, shell-cratered mud. No roads, no flat ground, just wreckage. Then came the firing itself. 800 to 1,000 shells a day was completely normal, and each individual shell could weigh anywhere from 18 to 200 pounds. That's an entire day of hauling dead weight, over and over, without pause. There was no hearing protection whatsoever, none. Crews stuffed whatever scraps they could find into their ears, and a huge percentage of these men walked away from the war partially or permanently deaf. A wound nobody ever put on a medal. And then there was the sheer terror of the gun itself becoming a bomb. Prematures, shells detonating inside the barrel before they even left the gun, were a constant, gruesome risk, especially once the shell shortage hit and factories started churning out ammunition with garbage quality control under brutal wartime pressure. Combine rushed manufacturing with guns fired far beyond their intended lifespan, and the barrel itself would occasionally rupture violently, killing or maiming every man standing near it. In 1915 alone, over 600 French guns were lost this way. Germany lost more than 300 field guns and 900 light howitzers to the exact same horror in a single year, numbers that actually rival what enemy action destroyed. Then came the gas shells. Originally, poison gas was simply released from cylinders and pushed toward the enemy by the wind, until commanders realized, often too late, that wind has a nasty habit of changing direction and blowing the gas straight back into their own faces. So the shell became the new delivery method, and artillery crews suddenly had an entirely new category of horror to handle shells packed with chemicals designed to burn a man's lungs from the inside, filling them with fluid until he essentially drowned standing upright, or mustard gas, engineered specifically to blister and maim rather than kill outright, leaving survivors disfigured for life. And here's the twist that made it even worse. These crews weren't just firing these shells at the enemy. They were storing, stacking, and physically handling thousands of them, working in full gas masks, knowing that if the enemy's fire ever hit their own gas shell stockpile, they'd be gassing themselves. The horses paid an unbelievable price too. 6 to 12 animals hauled every single gun, meaning millions of horses, mules, and donkeys were dragged into a war that had nothing to do with them, exposed to every shell, every gas cloud, every collapsing road, with none of the training or understanding to brace for any of it. And the crews themselves were never safe even between firing missions, because they were a top priority target. Silencing the enemy's guns could decide an entire battle, so both sides waged constant, deadly duels called counter-battery fire, trying to locate and destroy each other's batteries before getting destroyed first. By 1917, two methods had been perfected to hunt down a hidden battery: flash spotting, where observers in multiple locations took a compass bearing on a muzzle flash and triangulated the source on a map, and sound ranging, a genuinely brilliant, terrifying technique where a chain of microphones stretched across miles of front, and the tiny fractions of a second between when each microphone picked up the boom were fed into formulas built by civilian physicists, pinpointing an enemy gun's location to within a few dozen meters. Once your position was found, there was no running, no abandoning the gun. You stood there and kept doing your job while the enemy's return fire walked closer and closer. Artillery itself split into two extremes as the war ground on. On one end the trench mortar, a light close-range weapon that could lob a bomb in a slow, visible arc straight down into an enemy trench. A bomb you could genuinely watch falling toward you. Both sides despised it. The enemy hated it because it was devastatingly effective at close range. Your own side's infantry hated it just as much, because the moment a mortar team fired a few rounds and vanished, the enemy's artillery would immediately retaliate. And the poor infantry left holding that trench were the ones who paid for it. On the complete opposite end sat the railway guns, artillery so massive it had to ride on train tracks because nothing else could move it. The most infamous, the German Paris gun, could shell the city of Paris from 75 miles away, hurling shells to an altitude of roughly 25 miles, higher than any man-made object had ever traveled, a record that would only fall decades later to Germany's own V-2 rocket. It was almost useless as an actual weapon, wearing out after just a few dozen shots, and existed for one purpose only: pure terror against a civilian population that had no way to see it coming. By the war's end, artillery had completely rewritten its own job description, from a supporting cast member to the single deadliest force on the entire battlefield, responsible for roughly 60% or more of every casualty in the war. It didn't even need to hit you directly to break you. The sheer, relentless, ever-present possibility of a shell landing anywhere, at any moment, in any part of the trench system, shattered men's minds just as effectively as it shattered their bodies. The scale of it is almost impossible to picture. Estimates put the total number of shells fired during the war somewhere between several hundred million and over 1 billion, and as many as 30% of them may have failed to detonate on impact, meaning millions of live shells were simply left buried in the earth. To this day, French demolition crews still pull roughly 900 tons of unexploded World War I munitions out of the ground every single year, and since 1946, more than 60 30 bomb disposal workers have died doing exactly that job. Verdun, one of the worst-hit battlefields of the entire war, absorbed an average of 6 shells for every single square meter of ground, and remains fenced off today as an official red zone, permanently unfit for human habitation, over a century later. Remember those 600 guns from the start of this video. That's not a statistic. That's 600 crews who woke up, did their job, and never got the chance to fear the enemy, because their own weapon killed them first. That's the real, hidden cost of the war's true killer, not just the men catching the shells, but the men behind the guns, deafened, gassed, blown apart by their own weapons, and haunted for the rest of their lives by a job most people never even think about. If this opened your eyes to a side of the First World War you've genuinely never heard before, that's exactly what the War Files exists for. Subscribe, ring the bell so you catch the next one, and drop a comment telling us which weapon or story we should expose next. We read every single one.